There is a specific moment in any geopolitical crisis when the gap between the story being told and the reality being lived becomes too wide to hold together. We just watched that moment happen, live, on camera, in front of the entire world. Donald Trump walked up to a microphone, projecting the posture of a man who had already won. Victory declared, Iran neutralized, mission accomplished. The language was absolute, the confidence theatrical, the tone designed to close the chapter before anyone had time to read it carefully. And then, within the same press appearance, something shifted. Suddenly, the nations that depend on the Strait of Hormuz, he said, ought to handle protecting it themselves. America would help. America would assist. America would provide support from the side. Pause on that for a moment. Because that sentence, buried inside what was supposed to be a triumph speech, is one of the most significant things an American president has said out loud in years. Not because of what it declared, because of what it accidentally revealed. That is not the language of unchallenged supremacy. That is the sound of a command center discovering, in real time, that declaring victory and having a coherent plan for the day after victory are entirely different things. I want to walk you through exactly what happened here, why it matters far beyond the immediate military situation, and what it tells us about the structural condition of American global power at this particular moment in history. Because this story is not really about Trump. It is not really about Iran. It is about whether the architecture of influence that the United States built over 7 decades is being actively reinforced right now, or whether it is being quietly routed around by every government that has learned it cannot afford to depend on Washington unconditionally. That question has a financial answer, and the financial answer is considerably more alarming than the military briefings suggest. Part 1. The microphone moment and what it actually means. Let us start with what happened and reconstruct it precisely, because the sequencing matters enormously. Trump's opening position was total victory. Iran had been crushed. The threat was eliminated. American military power had demonstrated its unchallengeable dominance. This is the familiar rhetorical template: big declaration, absolute framing, language calibrated for domestic consumption and designed to project strength outward to every watching government. Then, within the same communication, came the pivot that nobody in his inner circle appeared to anticipate publicly. The nations dependent on the Strait of Hormuz should take responsibility for protecting it themselves, with American assistance available on the side. In geopolitics, sequencing is everything. The order in which things are said, the order in which actions occur, the order in which conditions are established. These sequences carry meaning that the surface content of any single statement cannot fully convey. If you genuinely have a situation under control, the sequence runs in one direction. You describe the resolution. You outline the terms. You explain the framework for stability going forward. The posture is composed because the situation is settled. If you do not have the situation under control, the sequence runs differently. You declare victory first because you need the headline. Then you quietly restructure the responsibilities because you need the burden distributed before the full cost becomes apparent. Then you reframe dependence on allies as partnership and burden sharing because that language sounds considerably better than admitting the original plan did not account for the day after. That second sequence is what we watched. And here is why the financial community should be paying close attention. Because credibility in international affairs functions exactly the way credit ratings function in capital markets. It is not a binary. It does not collapse overnight. It degrades in increments, each incident adding a small downward pressure, each contradiction accumulating into a pattern that rating agencies, fund managers, and foreign central banks all eventually price into their risk models. When the White House message moves from total victory to please help us manage the aftermath within a single press cycle, that is a credibility event. It does not make the front page of the financial press, but it registers. It registers in Doha. It registers in Abu Dhabi. It registers in Tokyo and Seoul, and every capital where finance ministers are currently running scenarios on energy supply security for the next 18 months. Part 2. The trust deficit that was already there. To understand why this moment landed as badly as it did, you need to understand the balance sheet that existed before this crisis began. Consider a scenario from commercial life. You have a business partner. Over the past several years, this partner has publicly insulted your most important clients, imposed financial penalties on your operations without consultation, made threatening statements about suppliers you both depend on, treated long-standing contractual arrangements as optional, subject to revision whenever they became inconvenient. And when you have raised concerns, the response has been dismissal, contempt, or counter-accusations. Now that partner calls you during an active emergency. They need your resources. They need your ships, your diplomatic cover, your regional relationships, your institutional credibility with local governments. They need all of it immediately. How many times have you answered that call before you stopped answering it? That scenario is not hypothetical. That is the precise conversation American allies and regional partners have been having internally for the better part of the last 2 years. The erosion of alliance credibility did not begin with the Strait of Hormuz. It began with a behavioral pattern that stretched across NATO relationships, across Pacific partnerships, across Gulf state security arrangements, across every diplomatic corridor, where American commitments have historically been treated as foundational rather than negotiable. Tariffs imposed on close partners without consultation. NATO framed as a protection scheme. Public humiliations of leaders whose domestic populations were then left to process the diplomatic damage. Threats deployed against allies in the middle of ongoing cooperation. The consistent treatment of long-term strategic relationships as transactional arrangements to be renegotiated whenever the terms seemed unfavorable. None of that was invisible. Every foreign ministry in the world has an institutional memory that functions regardless of which political party controls any government. The career diplomats and intelligence analysts tracking American reliability are doing so continuously, not in 4-year election cycles. And so, when the Strait of Hormuz became the crisis, and Trump issued the call for coalition support, he was not calling into a neutral environment. He was calling into a relationship ecosystem that had spent months quietly calculating exposure to American volatility, quietly drafting contingency plans, quietly building redundancies into systems that had previously been structured on the assumption of American reliability. The results were visible almost immediately. Part 3. The 3 receipts. Let me walk through the 3 specific pieces of evidence that define what actually happened here, because each one reveals a different dimension of the problem. The first receipt is the message whiplash itself. Early in this crisis cycle, Trump indicated that numerous nations, particularly those with the most direct dependence on Hormuz shipping, would be contributing naval forces to support American operations. The framing was coalition, partnership, shared mission. The familiar language of allied military cooperation that Washington has deployed successfully for decades. Within a short period, the framing had shifted. Those same nations ought to be handling the protection themselves, he said. America would help. America would assist. America would provide support on the side. Put those 2 statements side by side, and the contradiction is architectural, not cosmetic. You cannot simultaneously be leading a coalition and outsourcing the mission to coalition members. You cannot simultaneously have destroyed the threat completely and be urgently requesting that allies deploy to manage it. You cannot project total control from one side of a sentence and reveal actual dependence on the other side of the same sentence, without every government watching understanding precisely what that sequence means. Defenders of this framing will argue it represents responsible burden sharing. The United States asking allies to contribute proportionally to the security of maritime routes that benefit them commercially. That is a legitimate policy position. It is one that previous administrations have articulated in various forms. But burden sharing only functions as a credible diplomatic framework when it has been negotiated in advance, when the terms are clear, when the relationships are healthy enough to sustain the conversation, and when the request arrives before the crisis rather than inside it. Asking partners to share a burden while the building is already on fire, after months of telling them their contribution was inadequate and their loyalty was suspect, is not burden sharing. It is emergency outsourcing after the original plan revealed its limits. The silence from supposed coalition partners communicated everything that needed communicating. The second receipt is France. During the escalating crisis, claims circulated that France would be repositioning naval assets in support of a more assertive operational stance around the strait. A French rapid response official account moved quickly to push back. Their carrier group posture remained strictly defensive. Their operational focus remained within the Eastern Mediterranean. No strategic shift had occurred. In plain terms, not our mission, not on your terms, not now. Consider how genuinely unusual that public correction is in the context of Allied military communications. Nations that are aligned on a mission do not rush to publicly distance themselves from it. The institutional reflex within alliance structures is to avoid public contradiction, to work disagreements through private channels, to present, at minimum, a posture of coordination even when the reality is more complicated. When an allied government goes on record to clarify publicly that it is not doing what Washington implied it would be doing, that is a deliberate communication. It is institutional distance being established with documentation. It is a government saying, for the record, that it did not agree to what was being attributed to it. That kind of public correction does not happen among genuinely aligned partners in an active operational environment unless those partners specifically want the documentation. They wanted the record to show they were not part of whatever this was. The third receipt is the media pressure campaign. As the contradiction between the declared victory and the actual operational reality became increasingly difficult to manage through messaging alone, Trump turned to attacking the coverage. Headlines were misleading. Journalists were the problem. The media was distorting what was happening. This pattern is worth analyzing structurally rather than politically, because it reveals something important about the underlying dynamic. Leaders who have genuine control of a situation do not typically need to manage perception by discrediting the sources reporting on it. The confidence to allow independent coverage to exist comes from the ability to point to outcomes that speak for themselves. When you need the coverage itself to be discredited, you are implicitly acknowledging that the outcomes, left to be reported on without interference, do not support the narrative you are trying to establish. The simultaneous pressure on broadcasters through regulatory channels, allies of the administration deploying language about license renewal processes and public interest obligations in ways that critics read as intimidation, adds another layer to this pattern. Not the behavior of an administration operating from a position of settled strength. The behavior of one trying to control the information environment because the factual environment is not cooperating. Part 4. The structural question underneath the immediate crisis. Here is the analysis that rarely gets articulated clearly, because it requires stepping back far enough from the immediate situation to see the architecture rather than the event. American global power has always rested on two distinct foundations. The first is hard power, military capability, economic scale, the capacity to impose costs on adversaries. The United States retains that capability in abundance. The naval presence around the Strait of Hormuz represents real force. The precision strike capability demonstrated against Iranian targets represents real military effectiveness. Nobody serious is arguing that American hard power has been neutralized. The second foundation is soft power in its most practical, non-idealistic form. Not cultural influence, not shared values. The specific operational credibility that comes from allied governments believing that American commitments are reliable, that American leadership is predictable enough to build policy around, and that the cost of positioning against Washington's preferences is higher than the cost of working within the American-led system. That second foundation does not show up on any military capability assessment. It does not appear in Pentagon readiness reports. It is invisible until it starts to degrade, and then it becomes visible all at once, in moments exactly like this one. When France publicly declines to be associated with a mission Washington implied they had signed on to, that is a hard power event dressed in diplomatic language. When Gulf states that have historically structured their security around American guarantees begin building redundancies, that is a structural shift dressed in incremental portfolio diversification. When finance ministers in petroleum importing nations run calculations about yuan reserves versus dollar reserves, the underlying driver is not just Iran's Hormuz condition. It is the accumulated erosion of confidence that the dollar-based system will be managed with the stability that justifies the premium it charges. The Strait of Hormuz crisis and the petrodollar challenge are not separate stories happening simultaneously. They are two expressions of the same underlying dynamic, the gradual erosion of the trust premium that American global leadership has historically commanded, and the accelerating search by every major economy for insurance against American unpredictability. Part 5. What the Allies are actually calculating. Put yourself in the position of a senior official in Riyadh right now. Your economy depends on stable oil export revenues. Your security infrastructure has been built around a decades-long partnership with American forces stationed in your region. Your financial reserves are heavily weighted toward dollar assets. Your sovereign wealth fund managers have historically operated under the assumption that the dollar-based financial system represents the stable floor beneath everything else. Over the past several years, you have watched the American administration treat the foundational assumptions of your security partnership as negotiable. You have watched tariffs imposed on partners. You have watched NATO treated as a payment dispute. You have watched the administration imply publicly that long-standing security commitments have conditions attached that were not previously disclosed. Now you are watching the same administration declare total victory in a conflict that is visibly not resolved, then pivot immediately to asking regional partners to shoulder the burden of maintaining the waterway that is the primary revenue pipeline for your entire national economy. The question you are asking is not whether to abandon the American partnership. The question is more granular and more operational than that. The question is, at what level of American unpredictability does the cost of building alternative insurance exceed the cost of remaining entirely dependent on a partner that may or may not be reliable when the moment actually arrives? That calculation is being made in Riyadh. It is being made in Abu Dhabi. It is being made in Doha. It is being made in every capital that has historically structured its security and financial architecture around American reliability. And the answer to that calculation, in every one of those capitals, is moving in a consistent direction. Not away from the American partnership entirely, but toward more optionality, more redundancy, more alternative relationships maintained alongside the American one. More insurance against the scenario where Washington's internal politics produce a response that does not match the moment. That drift has financial consequences that compound over time. Central banks building yuan reserves alongside dollar reserves reduce structural demand for dollars. Governments signing bilateral trade agreements that route around the SWIFT system reduce the leverage that system provides to American foreign policy. Energy transactions completed in non-dollar currencies establish precedents that gradually normalize alternatives. None of this happens dramatically. None of it headlines. It happens in annual reserve composition reviews, in bilateral trade framework negotiations, in the quiet redirection of marginal flows toward alternative channels that have demonstrated they function. The Strait of Hormuz crisis did not create this dynamic, but it accelerated it visibly, in real time, in ways that even casual observers can now see. Part 6. The coalition problem and why it is deeper than this crisis. There is a reason the coalition response to this situation has been hesitant, and it runs deeper than any single policy disagreement. Military coalitions function on a specific kind of trust, not personal trust between leaders, though that matters, institutional trust between governments, the confidence that if you commit forces to a shared mission, the strategic objectives are clear, the rules of engagement are established, the exit conditions are defined, and the partner leading the coalition has thought through what happens after the immediate objective is achieved. That confidence is built over decades and degraded quickly. It requires consistency, transparency, and the demonstrated willingness to consult before acting, rather than requisition after deciding. The European partners who have hedged on this crisis have watched an administration that treats consultation as optional, that announces positions publicly before informing allies privately, and that has repeatedly demonstrated a preference for theatrical dominance over the slower, less satisfying work of genuine coalition management. They have also watched the administration openly discuss withdrawing from or restructuring the foundational security commitments that make European strategic dependence on American power rational. An ally that might withdraw from its commitments is not a reliable coalition anchor. It is a variable. And variables do not anchor coalitions. They destabilize them. The Gulf states face a version of this calculation that is even more acute, because the security guarantees at stake are more immediate and more existential for them. If American commitment to the region is now explicitly conditional on burden-sharing contributions being deemed adequate by an administration that has shown little interest in the details of prior consultations, then the entire strategic architecture that Gulf state security planning has been built around requires reassessment. That reassessment is happening. It is quiet because these are governments that maintain careful public postures. But it is real, and its financial consequences, in sovereign wealth fund allocation decisions, in central bank reserve compositions, in bilateral trade framework priorities, will be measurable over the next several years, in ways that compound significantly. Part 7. The media pressure and what it signals to markets. The third receipt deserves more attention than it typically receives from financial analysts, because it connects to something that markets price continuously and often without conscious acknowledgement. Institutional credibility in the information environment is a component of sovereign credit quality. The confidence that official communications from a government represent genuine assessments of real conditions, rather than managed narratives designed to paper over contradictions, is something that bond markets, currency markets, and equity markets price implicitly into their risk assessments. When an administration responds to contradictions in its public narrative by attacking the organizations reporting on those contradictions, it introduces a specific kind of uncertainty, not about the immediate facts being disputed, about the reliability of official information as a signal of underlying reality. Investors and governments that need to make long-horizon decisions about dollar exposure, about treasury holdings, about the operational reliability of the dollar-based international financial system are making those decisions based on their assessment of American institutional stability. That assessment includes the information environment, a government that pressures independent media through regulatory channels when coverage becomes inconvenient is a government signaling that its official communications may not be reliable indicators of actual conditions. That signal does not move markets dramatically in any single moment, but it contributes to a composite risk picture that accumulates. And in an environment where alternatives to the dollar system are developing faster than at any previous point in the post-war era, every incremental contribution to that composite risk picture matters more than it would have 10 years ago. Part 8. The longer pattern and where it leads. Step back further, and the pattern becomes clearer. American global leadership since 1945 has rested on a bargain. Not an equal bargain. The United States has always held by far the stronger position within it, but a bargain nonetheless. American security guarantees, American market access, American financial infrastructure, American diplomatic investment in multilateral institutions, all of these created a system that was genuinely beneficial to participating nations, even when those nations had to accept American preferences they would not have chosen independently. The sustainability of that system depended on American behavior remaining within a range that made the bargain rational for its junior partners. When the cost of accepting American leadership, in sovereignty constraints, in diplomatic alignment requirements, in financial system dependencies, remained lower than the cost of building alternatives, the system held. The dollar held. The alliances held. What happens when American behavior begins moving outside the range that makes that bargain rational? Partners start calculating the costs differently. The sovereignty constraints that seemed acceptable when American commitments were reliable become less acceptable when those commitments are explicitly subject to revision based on domestic political calculations. The financial system dependencies that seemed safe when American institutional stability was unquestioned become more concerning when that stability is visibly degrading. The alliance frameworks that seemed worth maintaining even through policy disagreements become more expensive to sustain when the leadership of the alliance treats them as personal loyalty tests rather than strategic assets. None of this reaches a tipping point suddenly. It moves in the way all structural shifts in international systems move, through accumulated marginal decisions that seem individually small, but compound into something transformative over a period of years. Trump's press conference moment, the message whiplash from total victory to "please help us manage this," is not the cause of this structural shift. It is a visible symptom of conditions that have been building for some time. But visible symptoms matter. They accelerate calculations. They move timelines. They give decision-makers in foreign capitals justification for moves they were already considering. The countries watching that moment are not naive. They understand the difference between a tactical communications failure and a strategic signal about the underlying reliability of American leadership. And they are drawing conclusions accordingly. Part 9. The financial architecture at stake. Bring this back to the financial dimension, because that is where the long-term consequences are most consequential and least well understood. The dollar's reserve currency status, the structural fact that central banks around the world hold dollar assets as the foundation of their currency reserves, is not maintained by American military power alone. It is maintained by the compound effect of American military power, American institutional stability, American market depth, and the accumulated trust that American-led systems will be managed in ways that protect the interests of participants broadly enough to make participation rational. When military power is evident, but institutional stability is visibly degrading, when the management of dollar-based systems is increasingly unpredictable, when the security guarantees that underwrite confidence in American leadership are openly subject to revision, the other components of that compound effect weaken. Central banks do not abandon dollar reserves overnight. The switching costs are enormous. The depth and liquidity of dollar markets have no equivalent. The alternatives are not yet fully developed. This transition, if it is indeed underway, will take years or decades to reach any kind of meaningful equilibrium. But the direction of travel is observable. Yuan reserve holdings have been growing consistently. CIPS transaction volumes are accelerating significantly year over year. Bilateral currency agreements between major commodity exporters and China have multiplied across every region. The Iranian Hormuz condition has demonstrated for 14 days that an alternative settlement system for oil transactions can function under real operational conditions. The Trump press conference moment. The visible gap between declared victory and actual operational reality. The Allied hesitation, the public French pushback, the regulatory pressure on domestic media. All of these contribute to the same underlying signal. The premium that American leadership commands, the trust premium that makes dollar holdings and dollar-denominated debt rational investments above and beyond what pure market mechanics would generate, is being eroded. Not eliminated, eroded. Incrementally, in ways that compound. Closing. There is a version of this story that gets told as a political story. Trump contradicted himself. Allies pushed back. The media narrative became complicated. That version is accurate as far as it goes. But the more important version is the structural story underneath the political surface. A global system built on the compound credibility of American power, military capability, institutional stability, predictable leadership, reliable commitments, is experiencing simultaneous pressure on multiple dimensions. The military dimension remains strong. The other dimensions are visibly under stress. In international systems, as in financial systems, the components that appear most durable are often the ones that are most dependent on the less visible components holding steady. The dollar's reserve status looks durable because the military power backing it is obviously formidable. But the military power is not what makes the dollar indispensable. The full compound of American reliability is what makes it indispensable. And reliability is exactly what is being eroded. The moment at that microphone was not just a communications failure. It was a window into the condition of something considerably larger. A system that has run continuously for nearly 8 decades, so embedded into the architecture of international commerce and security that most of the world stopped thinking consciously about the assumptions it rests on. Those assumptions are now being examined consciously, in real time, in government buildings and central banks on every continent. The missiles make the news cycle. The aircraft carrier deployments fill the foreign policy podcasts. The presidential press conferences generate the social media traffic. But somewhere in the background, finance ministers are updating their reserve composition models. Central bankers are revisiting their dollar allocation assumptions, and a generation of policymakers who grew up treating American reliability as a fixed parameter are beginning, quietly and methodically, to treat it as a variable. That is the story that deserves your attention. Not because the outcome is certain, but because the trajectory is visible, and the financial consequences of getting the analysis wrong are considerably larger than any individual crisis. I'm Catherine France. If this analysis added clarity beneath the surface noise, subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here. The structural analysis that explains why the world you are navigating today already looks different from the one you were navigating a few weeks ago. Drop your perspective in the comments. Do you think American alliance credibility is experiencing temporary tactical damage, or is this a longer structural erosion? The most useful analysis in these discussions comes from the combination of perspectives, not from any single viewpoint. This conversation is worth having carefully, and this is the place to have it.